Hello everyone. So today we're going to be learning about the ascending sensory pathways. These are the neural pathways that allow you to feel the things around you, from the chair that you're sitting on right now to the temperature of your room even. So the way that this lesson is structured is that we're going to look at three main things. We're first going to start off with an introduction on this term called somatosensation, and then we're going to have a quick overview of the function of each of the ascending sensory pathways, and then we'll finish off with a deep dive into the neuroanatomy of these ascending sensory pathways. So let's start off by quickly talking about this term called somatosensation, which gets tossed around when talking about ascending sensory pathways. And I believe that it's very important for us to have a concrete definition as to what somatosensation actually is right from the beginning. So to put it simply, somatosensation is literally any physical sensation that we feel when we touch things or move our body. It is physically feeling things. Now, there are different types of somatosensation, and this is something very important for us to understand. For example, the sensation of temperature, whether something is hot or cold, is a very specific type of somatosensation called thermoception. Conversely, the sensation of pain is a different type of somatosensation called nociception. So this is basically what somatosensation is. Don't overcomplicate it. It's physically feeling things, and there are different types of physically feeling things. Temperature and pain are just two examples. So great, we have these different types of somatosensation, but why is it important for us to actually understand this when learning about ascending sensory pathways? Well, it's because the different ascending pathways will be responsible for mediating different types of somatosensation. And this is what we're going to look at now when we look at the somatosensory functions of each of these pathways. What types of somatosensation are each pathway responsible for? In our body, we have two main ascending sensory pathways. The first one is called the Dorsal Column-Medial Lemniscus pathway, abbreviated as DCML. The second pathway is called the Anterolateral system. The reason why it's called a system is because it is actually made up of multiple different subtracts. The main subtract that is commonly taught is called the Spinothalamic Tract. So, a very important distinction. Spinothalamic Tract and the anterolateral system are not synonymous. They are not interchangeable with each other. The spinothalamic tract is actually a very specific subtract of the anterolateral system, and this is the one that we're going to focus on today. You'll sometimes see this abbreviated as ALST, but just remember ST is a subtract of AL. So, what are the types of somatosensation that each of these pathways mediate? Well, the DCML pathway will mediate three types of somatosensation. The first one is called fine touch. Sometimes you'll see this being called discriminative touch. An example of fine touch or discriminative touch is touching sandpaper and being able to feel those individual granules within your fingertips. That's fine touch or discriminative touch. The second somatosensation that the DCML pathway mediates is something called conscious proprioception. This refers to your ability to perceive the position of your body. And what does that actually mean? Perceive the position of your body. Let's do an activity together. I want you to close your eyes. Now lift your right arm up into the air. Notice how you're still able to approximately gauge where your right arm is in 3D space, despite you not being able to actually see your right arm. This is conscious proprioception. It is the ability for your brain to actually perceive the position of your body parts. The third somatosensation that is mediated by the DCML pathway is vibration, such as the buzzing of your phone when someone's calling you. So three things: fine touch or discriminative touch, conscious proprioception, and vibration. All three are mediated by the ascending tract that's called the Dorsal Column-Medial Lemniscus pathway, abbreviated as DCML. The ALST pathway, or the anterolateral system's spinothalamic tract, will mediate four 4 types of somatosensation. The first one is crude touch, which is basically the opposite of fine touch. This is, for example, wind blowing in your face. You don't know where exactly on your face the wind is actually blowing at. You just know that there's some sort of generalized sensation of that wind blowing against your face. That's that crude touch, sometimes also called non-discriminative touch. The second somatosensation is pain, and this includes itching sensations. This is also mediated by the anterolateral system. So when you get a cut, for example, the pain that you're feeling is going to be mediated by neural transmissions from the spinothalamic tract. The third somatosensation that is mediated by the spinothalamic tract is temperature. Whether something's hot and cold, your spinothalamic tract is responsible for telling your brain. The fourth somatosensation is called firm pressure. This is different to vibration in that vibration up here for your DCML pathway is more like high frequency pressure waves, whereas firm pressure you can think about as a constant pressure pushing down on you. For example, someone giving you a very firm hug or someone holding and gripping your arm. That's all firm pressure, and your spinothalamic tract will be responsible for mediating this type of somatosensation. Now, I want you to notice the difference between the types of somatosensation mediated by the DCML pathway as opposed to those mediated by the ALST pathway. To mediate fine touch, my neurons need to fire very fast because they need to keep up with my fingers moving across each granule on a piece of sandpaper. As soon as I touch a new granule, that signal, it needs to be instantly fired again for me to perceive this granularity. It's a very similar thing with conscious proprioception. You are constantly moving your body, whether that be waving your arms around, walking, speaking, and moving your lips. You're constantly moving. Your DCML neurons, as a result, need to fire very fast and quickly update the position of your body parts in space with each and every movement that you make. So again, there's this need for fast neural transmission. Same thing with vibration. Vibrations are by definition quick pressure waves. Your DCML neurons need to be very fast at firing, at conducting their signals so that they can actually register every single vibrating beat. So the main message is that the DCML pathway, to mediate these 3 types of somatosensation, they need to have neurons that fire very fast. What structure in the neuron allows the neuron to fire fast? Myelin sheets. So the key take-home message is this: DCML neurons are highly myelinated. And these highly myelinated neurons are specifically called A alpha and A beta fibers. Conversely, the ALST pathway does not need this fast, constant updating. Its neurons do not need to fire as fast, and as a result, its neurons either have very slight myelination, which are called your A delta fibers, or they completely have no myelination at all, they're unmyelinated, and these fibers are called your C fibers. So, to recap, DCML pathway fires very fast because you need to do fine touch, you need to do conscious proprioception, you need to do vibration, fast neural firing. As a result, myelinated A alpha and A beta fibers. Conversely, crude touch, pain, temperature, firm pressure, they don't need as much of a constant updating as these 3 up here. As a result, their neural transmission is slightly slower. They either have thinly myelinated A delta fibers or completely unmyelinated C fibers. Now, before we move on to neuroanatomy, I need to make one last important point about the function of these 2 ascending tracks. The DCML pathway and the ALST pathway will be responsible for somatosensation of the entire body except the head. So, for example, sandpaper grating against your cheeks will not be mediated by the DCML pathway. That fine touch of your face is not mediated by the DCML pathway. Similar thing with something like pain. If someone's punching you in the face, the pain that you feel is not going to be mediated by the ALST pathway. It is not mediated by it. All of the somatosensation fine touch, conscious proprioception, vibration, crude touch, pain, temperature, phone pressure of the face or the head will be mediated by the trigeminal nerve, which is a completely separate pathway, and we will not get into that today. Okay, sweet. So that's all of the annoying details out of the way. Now let's dive into the amazing neuroanatomy of it all. So in each of these two ascending sensory pathways, the ultimate goal is to get a sensory signal from my body to my brain. And in both of the DCML and ALST pathways, the pathway does this through a sequence of 3 neurons. The first, second, and third order sensory neurons. The first neuron in the pathway, otherwise known as the first order neuron, will project from my body to either the brainstem in the case of the DCML pathway, or it will go from my body to the spinal cord in the case of the ALST pathway. The second order neuron will then go from the brainstem or the spinal cord to the thalamus, and then the third order neuron will go from the thalamus to the cortex of the brain. And this is how I get from my body to my brain in each of the two ascending pathways. Now, remember the different levels of myelination in the DCML and ALST pathways. What were they? DCML were myelinated A alpha or A beta fibers, whereas ALST were the thinly myelinated A delta fibers or the unmyelinated C fibers. The reason why I remind you of these levels of myelination is because when we talk about A alpha, A beta, A delta, and C fibers, we are only talking about the first order sensory neurons in this 3-sequence pathway. The second and the third order sensory neurons are always well myelinated regardless of whether it's DCML or ALST. So now let's look at the neuroanatomy of these two pathways in more detail, and we'll begin with the DCML pathway. So let's just take the example of my fingertips feeling something. Because this is the DCML pathway, I must either be feeling something pinpoint or granular, so that is fine discriminative touch, or I would be feeling the position of my fingers in space, so conscious proprioception, or I'll be feeling something vibrating on my fingertips, such as the buzzing of my phone. Let's just say for the purpose of this example that I'm feeling sandpaper, so fine discriminative touch. For this signal or sensation of the sandpaper to get from my fingertips to my brain, there will be a sequence of 3 neurons. Remember, the first, second, and third order neurons. The first order neuron in red will have its cell body in this dilation of the dorsal root of the spinal cord called the dorsal root ganglia. This is very important to remember. It will project from my fingertips through the dorsal root of the spinal cord and then into this back part of the spinal cord here that's shaded in white called the dorsal columns. And this is where the DC in DCML actually comes from. Now, the dorsal columns are made up of 2 parts. The gracile fascicle, which is the more medial part of the dorsal column, and the cuneate fascicle, which is the more lateral part of the dorsal columns. Now, there is a functional difference between the gracile and the cuneate fascicles. Specifically, the gracile fascicle is responsible for mediating sensation of the lower limbs and the lower trunk, so lower limb and lower trunk, whereas the cuneate fascicle is responsible for mediating somatosensation of the upper limbs and the upper trunk. Now, notice how the head is not colored in either of these two diagrams, because remember, the DCML pathway and the ALST pathway are only responsible for somatosensation of the body and not the head. The head will not receive somatosensation through the DCML or ALST pathways. It is instead through the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so since we are in the fingertips, since we're coming from the fingertips, that's going to be in the upper limb, and so this is going to be in the territory of the cuneate fascicle. So my first order neuron will ascend via the cuneate fascicle. It will ascend into the medulla oblongata of the brainstem and terminate in this back part or this dorsal part of the medulla called the dorsal column nuclei. The dorsal column nuclei. Similar to the dorsal columns, the dorsal column nuclei are composed of two nuclei, the gracile nucleus and the cuneate nucleus. And as you would expect, these will correspond with the dorsal columns. So since I've ascended via my cuneate fascicle, I will terminate in the cuneate nucleus. Okay, so I'm going to terminate in the cuneate nucleus. So what has my first order neuron done? It has come from my body, my fingertips, gone through the dorsal root of the spinal cord here, the dorsal root of the spinal cord. Its cell body is located in the dorsal root ganglion. It will project through into this dorsal part of the spinal cord called the dorsal columns, which is made up of the medial gracile fascicle and the lateral cuneate fascicle. The gracile fascicle is responsible for the lower limb and lower trunk. The cuneate fascicle is responsible for the upper limb and the upper trunk. Now, because I'm coming from my fingertips, it's going to be part of the upper limb, so part of the cuneate fascicle. So it's going to ascend via this cuneate fascicle, ascend, terminate in the medulla oblongata in the brainstem. Specifically, it will terminate in this back part of the medulla called the dorsal column nuclei, which remember is made up of the gracile nucleus, more medially here, the gracile nucleus, and the more lateral cuneate nucleus. These nuclei correspond perfectly with the dorsal columns. So because I'm coming up via the cuneate fascicle, I will terminate in the cuneate nucleus. And so this is how my first order neuron gets from the body, the fingertips in this case, to the brainstem, specifically the medulla oblongata in the DCML pathway. So what next? Well, what happens is that in the cuneate nucleus, not only does this first order neuron terminate, but at the same time it also synapses with this second order neuron drawn in blue here. This second order neuron then arcs over to the other side of the midline, or in other words, it decussates, so decussates means cross over, and then continues ascending on this other side until it reaches the thalamus. This ascent on the other side we call a contralateral ascent. Now, we give different parts of this second order neuron very special names. This first part here that arcs over to the other side, this first part that decussates, is called the internal arcuate fibers. This second part that ascends contralaterally is called the medial lemniscus. This is where the ML in DCML comes from. So to recap, my second order neuron will decussate via the internal arcuate fibers. It will then ascend as the medial lemniscus ascend contralaterally until it reaches the thalamus. And so this is how my second order neuron gets from the brainstem to the thalamus. Now, the second order neuron projects to a very specific part of the thalamus called the ventral posterolateral thalamic nucleus, otherwise known as the VPL for short. At the VPL of the thalamus, my second order neuron will synapse with my third order neuron, which is drawn in yellow. This third order neuron will then project to my primary somatosensory cortex from the VPL. Now remember, the primary somatosensory cortex is somatotopically organized, which I've drawn on this hemisphere here. Now, since we are coming from the fingertips, we'd be in this lateral region of the primary somatosensory cortex. So if I were to draw on this side, it would be approximately this region here. And so this is how my third order neuron gets from my thalamus to the brain, or the primary somatosensory cortex, as I've written here. So let's just put it all together and recap everything. So remember, we're looking at the DCML pathway. What are the three types of somatosensation that I can look at? Well, it's either going to be fine touch, conscious proprioception, or vibration. In this case, let's just take the example of fine touch, so sandpaper against the fingertips. I will have my first order neuron in red with its cell body in the dorsal root ganglia, it will project from my fingertips through the dorsal root into the dorsal part of the spinal cord, ascend via the dorsal columns, in this case specifically the cuneate fascicle, and remember that this first order neuron is going to be heavily myelinated as an either A alpha or A beta fiber. It will ascend, and reach this dorsal part of the medulla oblongata and synapse there. In this case, it will synapse in the cuneate nucleus, which is one of the dorsal column nuclei. From there, a second order neuron will arise. It will decussate as the internal arcuate fibers ascend contralaterally via the medial lemniscus and terminate in the VPL ventro-posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. From the thalamus, a third order neuron will arise and take it the rest of the way to the primary somatosensory cortex, which somatotopically speaking will be specifically synapsing around about here because this is where the fingertips lie. Okay, now let's look at the ALST pathway and see how this is different from the DCML pathway. So remember that my DCML pathway is for fine touch, for conscious proprioception, and vibration. My ALST, on the other hand, is for my crude touch, pain, temperature, and firm pressure. So instead of sandpaper, let's take the example of feeling pain in our hands. So we're again going to have a first order neuron in red here that has its cell body in the dorsal root ganglia, much the same as in the DCML pathway. It is also going to project from the skin of the hands through the dorsal root of the spinal cord, and it's going to enter into the dorsal horns of the spinal cord, not the dorsal columns, the dorsal horn. Specifically, it is going to go into two parts of the dorsal horn called the substantia gelatinosa here, the substantia gelatinosa part, or it can also go into the nucleus proprius, which is here. Now, all you need to know about the substantia gelatinosa and the nucleus proprius is that the first order neuron can synapse in either one of them. However, it is more likely, or a greater proportion of first order neurons will instead go into the substantia gelatinosa compared to the nucleus proprius. That's all you need to know. So for the sake of our example, let's just say that it goes into the substantia gelatinosa. It will terminate in the substantia gelatinosa, and this will be my first order neuron. So how is it different from the first order neuron in the DCML pathway? Well, there are two key differences. Number one, my DCML pathway's first order neuron is going all the way from the body, from the fingertips, through the spinal cord and into the brainstem. So it's going from body to brainstem. Conversely, in the first order neuron of my ALST pathway, it's coming from the body, but it's actually just ending in the spinal cord. It doesn't go up into the brainstem. That's the first difference. The second difference is that you have to remember how these neurons here, these first order neurons in the DCML pathway, are the A alpha and A beta highly myelinated fibers. Whereas in the ALST pathway, what were they? They were the thinly myelinated A delta fibers or the unmyelinated C fibers. So A delta and C versus A alpha and A beta. That's the second difference. So my first order neurons will terminate in the substantia gelatinosa over here, or the nucleus proprius, but in this case the substantia gelatinosa. And what will happen is that they will synapse with the second order neuron in blue. The second order neuron will then decussate in the spinal cord. It will cross over the side of the midline via this white matter tract here, called the ventral white commissure. It will continue past this ventral white commissure and cross all the way over to this anterolateral part of the spinal cord, and then it's going to start ascending. It will ascend up the spinal cord up through the brainstem, again staying in this anterolateral position in the brainstem, ascend past the brainstem, and then it will continue ascending until again it reaches the VPL of the thalamus. Again, much like the DCML VPL of the thalamus. Now, this ascending part of the second order neuron that's ascending through the spinal cord is called the Spinothalamic Tract. And yes, I know this is very confusing. In your lectures at university or wherever you are, you would have been taught that this entire pathway that we're going to look at is called the Spinothalamic Tract. But technically speaking, the spinothalamic tract only refers to this ascending part of the second order neuron in the spinal cord. So this is a bit of a technicality here. The part of the second order neuron ascending through the brainstem is called the spinal lemniscus. So this is the second order neuron. Let's look at how it differs from the DCML second order neuron. There are three. In DCML, I'm going from brainstem to thalamus, VPL. In ALST, I'm going from spinal cord to VPL of the thalamus. That's the first difference. Number two is the fact that the decussation in my ALST occurs in the ventral white commissure of the spinal cord, compared to the decussation of the DCML occurring via the internal arcuate fibers in the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. So decussation in spinal cord versus decussation in brainstem. That's number two. Number three, after the decussation, the DCML ascends contralaterally via the medial lemniscus. Here, it ascends contralaterally in the ALST pathway via the spinothalamic tract in the spinal cord and the spinal lemniscus in the brainstem. So those are the three differences in the second order neuron between the DCML and the ALST pathway. Fantastic. So once my second order neuron in my ALST pathway has reached the VPL of the thalamus, it's going to synapse with my third order neuron, which again is going to bring it the rest of the way to the primary somatosensory cortex at the somatotopically relevant area, which in this case is still the hand or the fingers, so approximately here again. So this is the bare basics of the ALST and DCML pathway. Now, I just want to teach you some additional things about the ALST pathway because it's actually a lot more complex than I've made it out to be so far. We're done with the DCML pathway for now, but we're just going to focus a bit deeper into the ALST pathway. So what I've done here is I've removed most of the labels in the ALST pathway, but everything is exactly the same. I've left the label of the VPL and S1, the primary somatosensory cortex, because that's what we're going to focus on. So what do we know? We know that the third order neuron in yellow is going to go from the VPL of the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. Once it reaches the cortex, I will feel the pain. This is how the ALST pathway gives somatosensation, in this case pain. But notice how I've drawn the somatotopic map to exclude some parts of the cortex. This part up here and this part tucked away in the middle here are actually not part of the primary somatosensory cortex. They are very specialized cortical regions that are actually separate from the primary somatosensory cortex. So somatosensation is really only occurring in these yellow highlighted parts of the cortex here. So then what the hell are all of these other parts, these uncolored parts of the cortex responsible for then? Well, let's think about it. What else do we feel when we feel pain? For example, when we stub our fingers or when we accidentally cut our fingers when we're cooking. We feel emotion, right? We might be frustrated after cutting ourselves. We might be scared about how bad the cut is, how much we might be bleeding. These are all emotions, the emotional content of pain, for example. The spinothalamic tract also allows you to feel these emotions at the same time as you perceive the somatosensation. So how does it actually do this? Well, to mediate these emotions, everything is actually exactly the same, all the same, up until the thalamus. This is where it starts to differ. Instead of projecting to the VPL of the thalamus, my second order neuron will project to a different thalamic nucleus called the medial dorsal nucleus, abbreviated as the MD nucleus. From the MD, it will project to this green part of the cortex. This is called the cingulate cortex. This projection here from the MD to the cingulate cortex is how the spinothalamic tract will let us feel the emotional content associated with somatosensation. Now, as if it's not already cool enough, the spinothalamic tract also does a third thing. What is this third thing? Well, other than your skin, where else can you feel pain? Your organs. For example, heart pain during a heart attack, uterine pain during menstrual cramps, stomach pain when you're about to have diarrhea. These are all examples of organ pain. We call this organ pain visceral pain. Visceral means viscera. Viscera means organs. Visceral pain is the same thing as organ pain. So, how does the spinothalamic tract do this? Well, again, everything is the same up until the thalamus. The second order neuron, it will not project to the VPL. It will not project to the MD. It will instead project to this third thalamic nucleus that we'll look at today, called the ventral medial posterior thalamic nucleus, the VMP. From the VMP, a third order neuron, in red here, will project to the insular cortex, which is part of the insular lobe. And again, this is for visceral pain. So instead of drawing a hand here, I've drawn a stomach here. So it's an organ pain. So that concludes the lesson for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you've learned something today. Please leave any feedback or suggestions down in the comment section below. Good luck with the rest of your studies.